the end of the 16th century, while Europe trembled beneath the weight of plague, war, and whispers of witches, the northern hills of Hungary, now part of Slovakia, hid something far darker than folklore. A cold stone castle, a ritual of death, and a woman who turned blood into a religion. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, Countess, aristocrat, scholar, beauty. But history would remember her as something else entirely, the most prolific female killer ever recorded. She did not murder for revenge. She murdered to stay young, to preserve her beauty, to prove that the blood of the innocent could be harvested like medicine. The story you are about to hear is not myth. It is not folktale. It is fact buried in censored testimonies, sealed court records, and the screams of girls whose names history never cared to learn. This is a story of power without conscience, of cruelty protected by wealth, of silence paid for in flesh. If you're drawn to the shadows of history like we are, if you seek the truth hidden beneath the legends, then we invite you to step inside the castle walls. Subscribe to the channel, like the video to support our work, and prepare yourself for the horrifying true tale of the Blood Countess. The snow outside Čachtice Castle did not fall gently. It slashed sideways across the turrets like knives of ash, turning the Slovakian sky into a sheet of ice and steel. But within the thick stone walls, deeper than any draft could penetrate, the air was hotter than any winter hearth. It smelled of iron, of excrement, of dried roses crumbled underfoot, but mostly, it reeked of blood, not the metaphorical kind whispered in courtly gossip, but the real thing, thick, dark, and coagulated between the cracks of flagstone, forming slick rivers beneath the straw-strewn floors. Blood clung to the underside of wooden benches, soaked into tapestries, and clotted behind the nails of trembling servant girls. It pooled and dried and returned again, day after day, as if the walls themselves drank and bled with their mistress. And she, Elizabeth Bathory, Countess of Exed, sat at the heart of this stench like a queen enthroned in rot. She was not old, not yet, just past her 40th year. The lines beneath her eyes were more from cruelty than age. Her black gowns shimmered with metallic thread, her skin powdered so pale it seemed drained. Those who dared to meet her gaze swore her eyes burned, always searching, always wanting. But what they feared most was not her wrath. It was her hunger, an obsession not with love, nor politics, but youth itself. Youth as a resource, a balm, a possession, and most of all, a sacrifice. Each morning, before the sun touched the towers, the castle awoke to ritual. Servants were wrenched from their thin bedding, hallways scrubbed with vinegar, blood scrubbed from the flagstones, and the iron instruments, the claws, the branding rods, the pincers were prepared anew. She rarely touched the girls herself, at least not in the beginning. Her trusted women did that: Ilona Jo, Dorothea Sentes, and the towering Anna Darvulia. They were more than maids. They were keepers of the ceremony, the spine of the operation. It was Anna who taught her the purification rites, who whispered to her in the dark about the humors of the blood, the vitality in the marrow, the alchemy of suffering. She said pain released youth like steam from flesh, and Elizabeth believed her. At first, the girls came willingly, scullery maids, laundresses, orphans plucked from villages with promises of work. Their parents waved from frozen fields, grateful their daughters might serve the noble Bathory line. But weeks passed, letters went unanswered, and soon rumors sprouted like rot beneath floorboards. Girls went in, and no one ever saw them again. But inside Čachtice, no one spoke of this. They could not, because Elizabeth was nobility, because her uncle was a cardinal, because her cousin sat beside the king, because her family name, Bathory, was older than the stone chapel at the castle's edge, and so she became untouchable. That was when the slaughter became industrial. No longer one girl a week, but 3, 5, sometimes 10. Elizabeth began experimenting combinations of pain, angles of the blade, how long a girl could scream before her vocal cords ruptured. She recorded them in a ledger crimson ink, neat script, a scholar's mind trapped in a butcher's ritual. And always, she bathed. The large copper tub sat before the window, where the moonlight would touch her bare skin. Once the screams ended, once the last twitch of the body faded, the blood was funneled in warm, sticky, steaming in the winter cold. She lowered herself slowly, delicately, as if into holy water. Her maids stood by with towels. Candles flickered, throwing shadows across her collarbones and the ridges of her spine. She believed it made her young again. That blood was renewal. That terror could be distilled into beauty. But the cracks were already forming on her skin, in her mind, and across the empire she thought she controlled. Her skin, though powdered, began to peel in the winter frost. Her hair, beneath its black dyes, thinned and broke. She ordered mirrors removed from her chambers. Her meals became erratic, mostly herbs, raw meats, and strange broths made from boiled bones and goat's milk. She began hearing voices, whispers from the dungeon stones, instructions from beyond the veil. Anna Darvulia called them echoes of the other world, and Elizabeth began to think of herself not as a woman, but a priestess, a vessel, a godmother to an empire of eternal flesh. It was not murder, it was ceremony. She collected parts of the girl's teeth, hair, dried fingers, and stored them in velvet-lined boxes marked with Latin inscriptions. She had gowns sewn from the bloodied garments of virgins. She claimed the screams were a kind of music, and once commissioned a violinist to play over them. And still, no one stopped her. The local peasants knew. They found bits of bodies in frozen creeks, saw the flickering torchlight in the tower long after midnight. They heard the howls low, guttural, human and not. They prayed, they crossed themselves, but they said nothing, because who would listen? Who would believe? What was one peasant girl to a Bathory? But within the house, the servants began to falter. Some disappeared. Others grew mad. A young maid tried to run, screaming through the courtyard with her face flayed open. They caught her. They gagged her. Elizabeth had her sewn into a sack of thorns and tossed into the river. Her household guard, once loyal, began to drink heavily. The cook refused to work. The dogs refused to enter the northern wing. Even Anna Darvulia, her most faithful companion, grew ill. Her skin turned gray, her mouth red with sores. Some said she was cursed. Others said she saw what was coming and tried to leave. But it was too late. Elizabeth had grown addicted not to the ritual, but to the power. She no longer flinched when a girl died. She barely blinked when the blood hit her cheek. It was normal now. Routine. A necessity. And so, the castle became a machine, each scream a cog, each corpse a turning gear. And Elizabeth was its engine, its monarch, its god. But outside, the snow thickened, and within it, the silence of the king's envoys began to thin. Whispers had reached the court, letters from priests, testimonies from survivors, and finally, a name Georgi Thurzo, Palatine of Hungary, was assigned to investigate. But Elizabeth didn't know, not yet. She still bathed, still plotted, still believed herself untouchable. The Countess wore her blood like perfume, and in the dim winter air of 1610, Čachtice Castle exhaled one long, putrid breath. It would be its last. By the time the frost began to thaw and the first veins of spring bled through the hills of Upper Hungary, the eyes had already turned. Not the eyes of peasants, not the sobbing mothers or disfigured brothers who had long given up hope. No, these were eyes set higher, wrapped in fur-lined cloaks and seated in candle-lit rooms beneath royal crests. They belonged to men whose silence had once been bought with land, titles, and fear. But now that silence was fraying, a stench had drifted too far, and the woman in the tower had spilled too much blood to remain invisible. Elizabeth Bathory didn't know it yet, but her castle had begun to hollow from within. In the capital, whispers bloomed like fungus in the dark. At court, the young nobleman joked nervously, cruelly, that Bathory drank virgins to stay young. Others said her castle had become a monastery of death, where prayers were replaced with shrieks and confession came only after the skin was flayed from the back. But among these rumors were letters, real ones collected in secret by men who had once attended Elizabeth's feasts, kissed her ring, pledged loyalty to her father's house. And now, they feared what would happen if they didn't speak first. Georgi Thurzo, Palatine of Hungary, was no fool. He had watched the empire weaken under debt, its faith waver under Ottoman pressure, and its nobles rot from within. But Elizabeth was different. Her crimes, if the letters were true, threatened to unravel something far more delicate than reputation. They threatened the image of nobility itself. A countess, an educated, land-owning woman of one of Hungary's oldest dynasties, had supposedly built a slaughterhouse out of a castle. If it were true, it would be the most scandalous horror in the kingdom's memory. But if it were publicized, it could topple more than just Elizabeth. It could cast suspicion on every noble house that had looked away, every priest that had blessed her, every soldier that had stood guard while she dismembered innocence in the name of eternity. So Thurzo made a decision. He would investigate, but quietly. He would bring witnesses, but only those who had already broken. He would collect evidence, but it would be contained, archived, buried. He would stop her, but he would not let her scandal soil the aristocracy that raised her. And so, the trap was laid not with swords, but with ink. In the meantime, Elizabeth remained oblivious. She still dined alone at a long table set for 20. She still summoned girls from villages, now bribing parents with more coin than she once would have dared. She grew careless. Girls no longer vanished without trace. Now, they were dumped half dead, frozen, clawed at the edges of forests or in churchyards. Some crawled home. Others made it to the monastery at Tronsen, where frightened monks wrapped their wounds and trembled as they listened to what had been done to them. It was there that the accounts took on form. Nails driven under fingernails, needles into lips, flesh scorched with tongs, mouths sewn shut and then forced open with iron rods. One girl had her ribs broken one by one, and was then told to dance. Another was stripped and doused in honey, left in the courtyard until the insects burrowed into her mouth. And always, there was the blood, the endless draining of it, as if Elizabeth believed it held a kind of spiritual electricity. When the priests asked the girls why they hadn't fled, the answers were the same. The gates were locked, the guards were armed, and inside, the Countess was God. Even Elizabeth's inner circle had begun to change. Anna Darvulia was now dead, some said, from illness. Others whispered it was Elizabeth herself who grew jealous of her authority and poisoned her. Dorothea and Ilona had taken over more of the ritual duties. But they were drunk more often now, their eyes ringed with red, their hands shaking. They moved like ghosts. Elizabeth ordered more candles, more instruments, more bloodletting. She had lost the ability to tell sacred from perverse, or maybe she never knew. She wrote letters to alchemists. She demanded horoscopes. She wore necklaces filled with ground bones and rubbed powdered gold into her temples. One night, a servant caught her speaking to a wall, whispering in Latin, her hands dripping red, her dress torn and stained. But the wall said nothing back. Then, on a gray morning in December of 1610, the silence ended. Thurzo arrived with soldiers not in the dead of night, but in the cold daylight, under banners. No secrecy now, no quiet arrest. It was a reckoning. The gates opened without resistance. No one warned Elizabeth. What the men saw inside would never be fully recorded. Some claimed they found a girl, freshly beaten, still twitching on the table, her face torn in strips. Others said the bodies were hung like meat, some whole, some dismembered, arranged as if for counting. One man reportedly vomited into his helmet. Another fainted. The castle stank of iron, vinegar, and rot. Buckets overflowed. The walls were streaked. One servant was found muttering in the corner, holding a child's severed hand as if it were a holy relic. And there, in the middle of it all, stood Elizabeth, not screaming, not weeping, but calm. She looked at Thurzo, not with fear but contempt. "You dare," she said, "you, of all men." The accusation was not unfounded. Thurzo had once written her letters. He had attended her wedding feast. Their families had mingled for decades. But now, he looked at her as if she were something other than human, something rotted from within. There was no trial. How could there be? To put Elizabeth on trial would mean naming every noble who had visited her castle, every bishop who had taken her coin, every cousin of the king who had remained silent. So they buried her, alive, not in the earth, but in her own room. They walled her inside a single chamber of Čachtice Castle, one small window for food, no light, no visitors, just stone. She did not scream, not then, but in the nights that followed, the guards heard whispers, murmurs, sometimes laughter, sometimes weeping. Once, a terrible scraping, like fingernails against rock. She clawed at the walls. She recited prayers backward. She begged the ghosts of the girls she had killed to return and finish her. But none came. Just the rats. The Countess of Blood, the woman who drained hundreds for beauty, had been silenced not with fire, but with absence. A wall, a lock, a forgotten hallway. And outside, the snow fell again, clean and silent. Čachtice Castle stood quiet under a morning sky, the once lavish halls, which had echoed with weeping, begging, and flesh torn by instruments of sadism, now rang hollow. Guards patrolled out of duty, not necessity, and servants passed through the corridors as if walking through a mausoleum. Something in the bones of the place had shifted. Not peace, never peace, but something worse. The breathless silence that follows when evil has nowhere left to go. Elizabeth Bathory, Countess of Exed, was not dead, but she was no longer alive in any way that mattered. Behind the bricked walls of her bedchamber turned tomb, she paced in a line no longer than a coffin. The stone was cold. The food was stale. The air stank of her own sweat, the chamber pot, and something deeper, some spiritual rot rising from beneath the mortar itself. She slept in snatches, spoke to the shadows, and waited. For what? Even she did not know. There had been no formal sentence, no verdict read aloud, no defense, no prosecutor, no stage upon which she could play the tragic heroine she'd always imagined herself to be. The Palatine had gathered evidence. Yes, dozens of statements, confessions, bones, bloodied rags, and the testimony of survivors who could no longer blink without flinching. But these never saw the light of open court. The trial of Elizabeth Bathory did not happen, because it could not. To try her would mean putting nobility itself on the scaffold. To read aloud the tortures she inflicted would mean acknowledging how many nobles had enabled them. It would mean forcing the crown to admit its silence, the church to confess its indulgence, and Hungary itself to confront the monster it had not only created, but hidden. So instead, her servants were offered up like sacrifices. Ilona Jo, Dorothea Sentes, Katarina Benica. Their hands bore the bruises of guilt, but it was their class, not their cruelty, that sealed their fates. They were peasants, expendable, and so, in 1611 they were executed in public. 2 had their fingers torn off before being burned alive. 1 was beheaded in secret. Their bodies became the blood price for a crime that was never spoken of above a whisper in the halls of power. The nobility watched. The king remained silent. The people exhaled. Elizabeth, however, was neither killed nor cleansed. She was sealed, hidden, reduced from human to legend, not by trial, but by erasure. Inside her stone prison, her mind began to bend. The room was always dark. The only light came twice a day. When a hand reached through the small slot to bring bread and water, she never saw a face. She could no longer feel seasons. No sun warmed her hands. No moon soothed her at night. Time became a broken wheel, circling madness. Sometimes she whispered the names of her victims, not in remorse, never in apology, but like a priestess invoking sacred words, as if summoning their blood might return her strength. Sofia, Katalin, Margit. She chanted them for hours, mouthing syllables until they no longer tasted human. She clawed at the stones, until her nails cracked and peeled. She tore her dress into strips and tried to stuff them into the cracks in the wall, hoping to dam the voices that bled through the mortar at night. Because there were voices now, low, hissing things, girls screaming from beneath the floorboards, mothers praying in foreign tongues, and Anna, always Anna, who whispered that she had never truly taught Elizabeth everything. She scratched prayers into the wall with a shard of bone from her own foot. The prayers didn't work. By the 2nd year of her imprisonment, Elizabeth had stopped speaking altogether. Her skin broke open with sores. Her teeth loosened. She tried to eat them when they fell, as if consuming her own decay might keep the rot away. By the 3rd year, she no longer knew whether she was alive. But the worst part wasn't the pain or the filth or the silence. It was the forgetting. The world outside moved on. Other nobles married, schemed, waged wars. The king took new mistresses. The church turned its gaze to the Protestants. Villages burned, borders shifted, and Čachtice faded like a ghost into the hills. No one spoke her name. Even the girls who survived rarely uttered Elizabeth. She became her, the lady, the thing in the castle. The living victims could not bear to give her form. The dead could not speak at all. And so she decayed, inch by inch, behind her silent walls. Then came the storm, August 1614. A night so thick with thunder it shook the tiles from the roof. Lightning stabbed at the horizon. Rain hammered the tower like it wanted in. The guards, huddled in their quarters, passed around bottles of palinka and told each other it was just weather. But in the sealed chamber, something broke. A scream sharp, dry, and high like a bird's final cry echoed from within the wall. Then a silence so heavy it felt physical, like dirt being shoveled into a grave. In the morning, the guard found the food untouched. The window slot was damp with condensation, as if something had breathed its last against it. They pried the wall open, slowly, reverently, afraid. And there she lay, not sprawled, not mutilated, not grotesque, just still. Her hair had turned completely white. Her body was thin, not skeletal, but sunken like a candle burned halfway, still holding its form but hollowed from within. Her eyes were open, her lips parted, as if about to speak. But she was gone. The Blood Countess had died without a word. No funeral was held, no rites, no procession. Her body was buried beneath the chapel, deep enough that no curious pilgrim might ever disturb her. And that was the end, or so they thought, because within months, the stories returned. Peasants swore they saw blood flowing uphill. Dogs howled at the castle ruins. Girls disappeared again, this time never traced to Elizabeth, but spoken of as her echoes. Her legend seeped into nursery rhymes, ghost stories. Whispers passed between midwives and old women who remembered the names she had once written in blood. But none of those tales included what mattered most, that her death was never justice, that her trial was a lie, that the real crime was not her cruelty, but the silence of those who stood beside her while she turned a castle into a slaughterhouse. She died in darkness, and the world breathed easier because it had forgotten. Long after the chamber was resealed, long after the guards were reassigned and the castle keys hung on forgotten pegs, Čachtice stood like a wound that refused to close. Ivy crept up the stones. The tower roofs collapsed one by one. The air grew heavier there, as if the castle itself exhaled guilt with each season, each storm. Inside, the old blood dried to a dust finer than flour. The shrines to agony, the racks, the cages, the brands rusted, corroded, disappeared beneath cobwebs and silence. But the memory did not. It never would. Elizabeth Bathory, dead, buried, erased from court records, had slipped the grasp of earthly justice. But history, ever vengeful, did not forget her. It repackaged her, reanimated her, and offered her back to the world not as a criminal, but as a creature. The transformation began quietly, in taverns and markets, among peasants who had no books but endless memory. They spoke not of the real woman, the landowner, widow, and political chess piece, but of the specter, the lady with blood on her teeth, the one who lured girls with coins and burned their innocence into screams. Her story bent and twisted with every retelling. Her name changed depending on the village. Some called her the Red Queen, others the Beast of Čachtice. Others still claimed she had never died at all, that she roamed the hills at night in the form of a white wolf. Then came the writers, nearly a century after her death. Hungarian scholars began to dig through the hidden ledgers, the sealed testimonies. They found enough to confirm the scale, but not the truth. The records were riddled with contradictions. Survivors had vanished. Documents were redacted. Political motives laced every page. What was left was not a confession, but a canvas. And on that canvas, writers painted with terror. By the 18th century, Elizabeth was no longer a woman. She was myth, vampire, witch. Some claimed she had bathed in blood to remain youthful. Others said she drank it. Bram Stoker's Dracula would come centuries later, but the bones of Bathory's legend were already there: noble blood, sadistic rituals, immortality through pain. But the truth that was messier. In the preserved court files, what few exist, she is described not as a monster, but as a noblewoman under suspicion. There are mentions of torture, of bloodletting, of confessions wrung from terrified servants. But no official record survives of her own voice. No final words, no gallows speech. She left behind no diary, no apology. What she left behind was absence, and into that silence, the world poured whatever it needed: a cautionary tale, a Gothic horror, a symbol of feminine evil. The church was eager to turn her into a warning. The aristocracy was eager to distance themselves. Feminist scholars centuries later debated whether Bathory was a victim of power politics framed for her land, her gender, her autonomy. Others argued that the real horror was not her legend, but the system that allowed it to happen and did nothing until it was politically convenient to act. But the villagers never debated. They remembered the screams. In the decades following her death, Čachtice Castle became cursed ground. Farmers refused to walk near it after dark. Children dared each other to touch the stone archway. Shepherds left offerings of salt at the base of the hill. Not because they believed in ghosts, but because they feared memory. Even now, the ruins remain. Tourists walk among the broken towers, pose for photographs where girls once bled, buy trinkets carved into fangs and crosses. They speak her name, Bathory, with a thrill. They say it like it belongs to fiction. But beneath the stone, beneath the dust and souvenir coins and staged reenactments, the truth still sleeps. The real woman, clever, connected, raised on cruelty and groomed to rule, was never punished. She was hidden. She was made legend so that the reality could be forgotten. And in that forgetting, the world allowed it all to happen again. Other girls vanished, other nobles killed, other horrors unfolded under banners of silence, of blood, of wealth. Because when justice is denied, myth rushes in to bury the evidence. Because when a woman like Elizabeth Bathory is allowed to thrive in darkness, it is not only her crime, it is ours. And so she remains, not beneath the earth, but behind the mirror, in every whispered rumor, in every young girl who disappears without answer, in every place where pain is turned into power, and no one dares speak. The hills around Čachtice are quiet now. The castle is broken, its stones scattered like discarded teeth, its great tower fallen to ruin. But when the wind cuts just right through the trees, the silence feels thick again, like breath caught in the throat of the earth itself. And in that silence, there are stories. Not spoken aloud, not recited in tour guides or classroom lectures, but remembered, buried beneath generations, stories of young girls, nameless and pale, led by the hand toward gates that only opened one way. Stories of a woman who believed she could own youth, wear it like a second skin, soak it into her bones and return to the mirror unchanged. And above all, stories of what silence costs. Because Elizabeth Bathory was not just a killer. She was a mirror held up to a society that chose silence over justice, blood over truth, power over life. She was made a legend to protect the legacy of those who should have stopped her. And in that transformation from noble to beast, from woman to monster, she escaped the one thing she truly deserved: to be remembered clearly, not as a vampire, not as a myth, but as a woman of rank, protected by her own, who carved agony into the bodies of hundreds because she knew no one would stop her. Her grave is hidden now, her castle crumbling. But she is not gone. She lingers in every system that lets the powerful prey on the powerless and calls it order. In every wall built to keep secrets in and justice out. In every wound the world refuses to see.